I'm just going to go through the Gemara and try to weave in some interesting ideas along the way, and hopefully we'll all come out with an appreciation of some interesting points on the blot. So, Masechta Nedarim begins Kol Kinui Nedarim K'Nedarim, and it's the third Masechta in Seder Nashim, following Yavamas and Ksuvas. Perhaps a little odd that it's even in Seder Nashim. Nedarim is not specifically something that you imagine is an ishus or a matrimonial concept, but it is the fact that the actual Parsha of Nedarim, which is in Matos, the first 18 psukim or so of Matos, is a discussion relating to a father being mater mefer. Actually, mefer is not the same as mater. Being mefer the Nedarim of his daughter or a husband of his wife. And therefore, the Rambam writes in Pirush Mishnayos here, and the Taisus and Nazir, that therefore this comes right after Ksuvas, which has a lot of the halachas of a woman who gets married at age 12 and a half, and it's sort of a continuation. There's also a Parak HaMadir, which talks about being Madir Hana. So therefore, there's some loose connection to the prior Masechta. Now, before we begin, there are some, basic concepts that aren't discussed. The Mishnah, as it often does in the case of many Mishnayos, just jumps right in. Right? When do you read the Shema B'Arvis? The first Mishnah in Brachas. No one ever told you there's a halacha of, saying Shema, right? Yavamis, Chamesh Esrei Nashim. There are 15 women who, when they fall to Yibam, they pater their tsaris. No one told you the halachas of Yibam. The Shulchan Aruch goes in that kind of style. We'll lay out the basic foundational points. Who is mechuyev to get married, and then discuss halachas of marriage. That's not the way Gemara works. And here, Kol Ki Nedarim just jumps right in, assuming you know something about Nedarim. So, because we shouldn't assume that necessarily, the Ran helps us out and gives us some background points. And I'm going to go through a few of these points of background before we actually just jump into the Gemara. So, there are two types of Nedarim. The Ran says this out. One is a neder of a nidrei hegdish, right? You donate something. You say this, this tissue box here, which I'll be actually consecrating the whole shir today. This tissue box right here is hegdish, right? And therefore that can be used by a shul, it can be used by the base of English, or used whatever, right? Or you can say something's a carbon, right? That's the classic case. Now the Torah gave you the authority, like a superpower, as it were, to actually take an animal and say, abracadabra, you are a carbon, and boom, it's a carbon. It's almost magical if you think about it, that you can utter some words and a very serious set of Yisurim have been created. But that is a superpower you have. And not only does it apply to karbanos, but you can invoke that authority. This is the way the actual Chazon Ish explains this. You can invoke that authority and draw that authority onto something that is not a carbon, something that is not hegdish. You can effectively invoke that authority you have to make things holy and say, I can make this tissue box holy too. Okay? Now, if you think about it from that perspective, it quite makes sense that the standard lashon, or the ikr lashon of a neder, should be, this tissue box is usher like a carbon. Okay? Because you're in fact invoking that carbon-making superpower you have and applying it to this tissue box. Right? And in fact, that is an ikr lashon neder. The actual standard form, if you will, of a neder is to say, this item is usher like a carbon. Okay? We'll see in a second, and maybe you don't have to say like a carbon, but everyone will hold what I just described is the ikr lashon of a neder. Okay? That's a standard lashon of a neder. Now,
does everyone hold it's the ikr, or that's a machlokes rishonim?
It's a machlokes rishonim whether also saying without a carbon is not the ikr. So the Ran holds it could be ikr with, you say it's usher like a carbon, or it's just usher, but everyone holds for sure that's also an ikr. Okay? Now, you then get to the question of what if you don't actually use the standard formulation? This is usher like a carbon, right? What if you actually substitute some alternative things? My name isn't Yankee, it's really Yaakov David, right? But everyone calls me Yankee, you know full well what you're referring to, right? So there are kinuyim, which are in a sense like slang, substitute expressions, alternative expressions, but they're not the true expression, not the standard formulation. There's something that's related and similar enough. There's a kinuyim, like Hamachan Shem Kaver, someone who has a nickname for someone else. Okay, the halacha is that kinuyim work too. Okay, well, in a second we'll discuss what a kinuyim are. The kinuyim are basically an alternative expression. So instead of saying this tissue box is usher like a carbon, it's like a konem, koneach. Right? The Mishnah on Daf Yud describes all sorts of different corruptions, if you will, of the word carbon, which are also acceptable. Okay. Finally, there are yados. Yados are not where you've actually said the standard formulation, but you merely substituted one term for the standard term. You actually didn't utter the full standard formulation. You truncated it. You left some of it out, right? And because you left some of it out, there's a question of, well, should this be a valid neder? And the answer is, it might be a valid neder depending upon how much you included. Did you include enough so that we can divine your intention and know surely you meant a neder? Right? Those are yados, handles. Called handles because you can pick up a mug by picking up its handle. You can pick up a whole neder, by actually picking up the handle, some important, seriously material part of it, if you will. Okay, that's just the basic concepts. It's assumed you know all this before the Mishnah even begins, right?
So the word koinam is a kinoi of karba?
That's exactly right. Yes. In fact, so why don't we just discuss, based on that question, discuss one point. There's a machlekes amarayim, what is the origin of kinui? Clearly, konam is a kinui of carbon, but what is the origin of these things? So it's a machlekes on Daf Yud, although it's brought down Daf Gimel, for those of you got into Daf Gimel. Rabbi Yochanan holds they're merely the expression of carbon in other foreign languages. They're Shiva Lashonos, there's 70 languages. In some other languages, they use the term konam instead of carbon. Interesting, right? Now, and before we get to the issues, that Reish Lakish says no, that's not the case at all. Perhaps he was historically just arguing. He's not aware of any other of the Shiva Lashonos that have this kind of expression. He says there were actually newly created expressions established by Chazal for the purposes of making Nedarim. If you think about the way a person classically makes something into a carbon, which is, I said, the source of your superpower, as we said, to make Nedarim, you say carbon la Hashem. Okay? You say this animal is a carbon la Hashem. In fact, it's interesting. The Gemara tells us that it's better, you can either make a carbon by saying carbon la Hashem or la Hashem carbon. They're both equally effective. But it's far better to say carbon la Hashem. Why is it far better to say carbon la Hashem? Because what if you die in between? Imagine you said carbon and then you didn't say La Hashem, nothing has happened. But God forbid you said La Hashem and then the person were to drop dead before he said carbon, he was Mighty Shem Shemayim Levatala. So Chazal were very concerned with people when they invoke the expression carbon La Hashem about saying Hashem's name Levatala. And therefore, Zak Reish Lakish, Marx says this explicitly, they created these new expressions which were not associated with the word La Hashem. You wouldn't normally say konach, konam la Hashem. You wouldn't say that. You'd say carbon la Hashem. And therefore, there was a risk. If you'd say this is usher like a carbon, you'd say this is usher like a carbon la Hashem. That la Hashem that you said is just absolutely for no purpose, and it would be shem shemayim levatala. Therefore, they created these expressions. Just say out loud, there are advantages and challenges with each of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. According to Reish Lakish, if these are expressions that Chazal created, meaning midaraisa, if you'd say this tissue box is usher like a konam, midaraisa, that wasn't a neder. Does that mean that when you say konach, that these are only usher midrabanan? Indeed, there are Rishonim who hold that way, although most do not. On the other hand, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if these are just slangs in other languages, so just say, all l'shainis of Nedarim work. Why do you specifically choose these three ones? Not so pashut. Some say it's a chiddush because these l'shainis are sort of not really in the other 70 languages. They're just like corruptions that they borrowed from Lashon HaKodesh, and therefore they shouldn't be given the full status. Anyway, I don't want to go too much more into this. This is all much more discussed in Daf Yud. Anyway, that's the background. We have Ikrei Nedarim, which are this item is also like a carbon. We have kinuyim, which are basically you say that basic formulation, but you substitute something else for, let's say, carbon. And then you finally get to yadas, where you have an incomplete expression, but it's sufficient. Okay. So kol kinuyim nedarim kinedarim. All kinuyim, these slangs of nedarim, have the halacha of a neder. Okay. Kol the charamim kecharamim, and the same is true of charamim. Okay. If a person says, well, let's actually back up for a second. What is a cher? Okay, so since the Mishnah is ambiguous, naturally there's a machlekes rishonim. You can find that throughout, Shas. If something's ambiguous, you often will get machlekes rishonim. So there's two possibilities of what a cherem are. Okay, possibility one, it refers to cheremei bedek habayis. A person could say this item is a cherem for the base medrash. It's actually another form of making hekdesh. Okay, there's slight differences in halachas, whatever, but basically it's very similar. You can also use the word cherem to say that this item is a cherem and usher in a sense of a neder. Okay, you could say this item is cherem to me. To me, that's not the bezach bias. It means it's usher to me. I can't. This tissue box is a cherem to me, right? So it could be referring to another form of hegdish, or it could be referring to basically another form of nidar, right? Either one is possible. The Rush says,
would that be like the same like Yados? Because he's doing it on me, not on anything in hegdish.
so there is a big discussion about whether so if you didn't have this category of chayrim, you might have thought it might have been yadis, right? But it is a separate category, and therefore it's different in that sense, right? So it's true if I said this is usher on me, that might be a yad, it might be an ikr neder, as we'll say in a minute with Iran. But you're right, chayrim is for sure an ikr concept because that's in the Torah and that's direct. Okay, so it's in a sense a little different. But your question is fair, but it's more a question on Nidarim Gufa than necessarily Charam is what I'd say. So those are the two possibilities of Charam. The Rush says, well, we already discussed, to begin with in Kinu Nidarim, we already discussed basic Nidarim. Clearly, if this is just another version of Nidarim, it'd be redundant, right? Therefore, the Rush learns, and many other Rishayim learn, it's referring to Chermi Bedek Abayis. Okay? So when it says Charam Kecharam, that's what it refers to. The Ran, however, interestingly learns that it's referring to just another case of basically Nidar, which begs the question, why do you need new cases? Okay, so I'm now going to note something that was was brought up actually a few minutes ago, which is, although the Ran holds that the Iker Lashon of a Neder is to say, this tissue box is usher like a carbon, he says it's also the Iker Lashon of a Neder to say this tissue box is usher. Okay, you don't actually have to invoke the carbon superpower, as it were. You could just say that, which is interesting. Most Rishonim disagree. Okay, but he has basically two versions of it. Rav Shmuel Rozovsky actually says this is what's meant by charam kecharam. There are two types of ikr nidarim according to the Ran. The first one is you say it's usher like a carbon. That's called kinuy nidarim kenidarim. There's another one where you don't actually have to mention that, and that is because it's based upon your superpower of charamim, right? And therefore it says kol charam kecharam. Right? It's really interesting. So in both cases, your ability to make a neder is based upon your ability, that the God-given capability you have to make something usher, either a neder for a carbon or a charamim. Just in the case of charam, you don't have to say lashem. You don't say carbon lashem, and therefore charam don't require that either. Anyway, so we have charam kecharamim. The next case we have is called kinuyei shavuos k'shavuos. All the kinuyim of shavuos, nicknames of shavuos, have the same thing. What's the nickname of shavuos? Shavusa, shavuka. Again, these are all on Daf Yud. Okay, now. It's interesting, if you look in Gemara Shavuos, it doesn't actually say called Kinei Shavuos Keshavuos, right? Nazir it does, and the Gemara will ask on Beis, how come you mentioned one and not four? But in Masech Shavuos they don't discuss Kinei Shavuos Keshavuos. Okay, so which begs the question exactly, why is it discussed here and not there? And Taisa says the reason is because there's no such thing as Yad Shavuos. There's no such thing as a Yad of Shavuos. Not so pasha, because if you hold Shavuos b'lashon neder works, that's a yad of a shvua, but that's what Taisus actually says in Nazir. But in terms of the basic formulation of a shvua, okay, you need to understand what that is before you can understand what is a kinui of it, right? If you say I make a shvua that I'm not going to use this tissue box, that's a shvua clearly, and maybe if a shvuka that I'm not going to use this tissue box, that's a kinui of a shvua, right? But does the basic formulation of a shvuah require you to say Hashem's name? Okay, that's an interesting question. The halacha is if a person says, by the Eibishter, I'm not going to, use these tissues. You've made a shvuah, absolutely made a shvuah. Okay, by merely invoking Hashem's name, and maybe even by Racham, by Chanan, which are actually kinuyim of Hashem's name. You've clearly made a shvuah. Merely mentioning Hashem's name or clearly referring to Hashem's name would make a shvuah. This was a style actually back in biblical times. You saw Yosef Hatzadik when he'd want to swear falsely to his brother. He'd say Chei Paroi, by the life of Paro. Paro was like a deity, in the times of Mitzrayim. So you'd actually invoke a deity to say this is a serious thing, and it's sort of introducing a shvuah. If that's the case, though, a lot of Rishonim point out that if it's the case that saying merely invoking Hashem's name creates a shvuah, right? Just like invoking a carbon creates a neder. Invoking Hashem's name actually creates a shvuah. So who cares whether kinuyei shvuos are kishvuos? Invoke Hashem's name. I don't care whether you don't even have to say the word shvuah. If I say by Hashem's name, I'm not going to use these tissues, it's a shvuah. I'd have to say the word shvuah, and it certainly doesn't make a difference if I said shavuka or shavusa. It's irrelevant. Just saying Hashem's name is what's required. So it must be, many Rishonim say, that you don't have to use Hashem's name to make a shvua. However, if you don't, you then either have to use the word shavua or a kinui shvua, which is shvuka, shvusa, etc. So it turns out there are two types of ikrei shavuos at all. Well, the first three cases have all two types of, ikarim. There's nidarim, which is the ikr way you, according to the Ran at least, the ikr way you actually make a neder, which is say, this is also like a carbon, like a carbon. There's the ikr way number 2 for a neder, which is to say, this is a cherem, but you don't actually have to mention like a carbon, say, this is just usr. And for shavuos, that's also true. You could just say, by Hashem's name, this is usr, or say, I'm making a shvua, this is usr. Okay? Now, there are those who argue that say, no, you always need the Shem Shemayim, but that only is where someone else is causing you to swear. Like you go to Bezdin, so, they want it to be a serious shvua. They have the whole procedure there. You see in Shulchan Aruch, they open up the Aron, you have to hold the Sefer Torah, they tell you all the terrible things that happen if you swear falsely. So for there, you can imagine, in the awesomeness and seriousness of the moment, they're going to force you to say Hashem's name. But putting aside those type of shvuas, maybe it's not required actually to use the Shem Shemayim.
Well, what would be the difference between the kinoi of shvua and the kinoi of cherem? They'll both be aser. You said
it would be, but cherem is
how would you differentiate?
The one is an iser gab, one is a chefrsayin on the base, right?
Saying the way you would
cherem lechura is because it's a chura. If you hold it to neder, basically, which everyone holds it is. The question is it also referring to Bedek bias? But if you hold it to neder, it's clearly an iser. Is a chefsa. There are nafkaminas between that. We'll go through that on the base. Okay. One other question, which I forget your name. Howard asked, which is an interesting question, which I don't know if this is the right territory, but it's an interesting question. He asked, it says, Kol kinoi nidarim kinidarim. All kinuim of nidarim are like nidarim, which somehow suggests they're not actually nidarim. You could have said Kol kinoi nidarim. Right? Why nidarim? So this is an important point, or I would like to suggest this is because of an important point, which is halacha is kinuyim work, but kinuyim do not work. A kinui of a kinui, a slang of a slang, is too far removed from the actual ikr lashon neder, and actually it's ineffective. So it could be it's saying kol kinui nidarim are like nidarim in the sense that they are fully enforceable, but they're not full-fledged nidarim. Because if they were a full-fledged nidarim, a kinui of that kinui would work too, right? So therefore, it's only that. But anyway, the important point is that a kinui of a kinui doesn't work. Weiter, it says the naziris k'naziris, and kol kinui naziris are like naziris. Okay, we'll discuss a little bit on Amid Beis what is the nature of naziris, and we get to iser chefsa, iser gabra. Okay, so now we've gone through the basics of the ikr nidarim and the kinuyim. The Mishnah now turns to yados, okay? The handles, these truncated expressions which aren't the full expression. So Zalaimer lechavero, person says to his friend, Mudrani mimcha, I am avowed from you, mudr is lashon of neder. Mufrashani mimcha, I am separated from you. Murchani mimcha, I'm distanced from you. He says, those things, by the way, themselves are nothing. What has to be added on is one of the next two things in the Mishnah. What do I add on to my mudranim nimcha? Sha'ani eichelach, that I will eat from you. Now, by the way, the Rif says in this entire Masechta, wherever you see the word lecha or lach, it means mishalcha, mishalach, or li, it means mishali. So in other words, mudranim nimcha, I am avowed from you, I'm distanced from you, I'm separated from you, from what I would eat from yours. Okay, or from what shani tayamach, what I taste of yours. Okay, so let's see what this person says an expression. It was not, this tissue box is usher on me like a carb. And he says, I am distanced from you from your tissues, from using your tissues, from benefiting from your tissues. Now, that sort of seems like he's saying a neder, right? Because he's saying, I'm separated from you, I can't, basically indicating you can't use these tissues, right? And therefore, the Chazal tell us that is sufficient. Okay, that is sufficient in order to create a neder here. Okay, it's a yad of a neder. It's not the full-fledged language because he should have been a little clearer if you want to do an ikr neder and say, this tissue box is usher to me like a carbon. But he said enough of that so we can divine his intentions and actually understand that what he meant was to give a full neder. Okay, so the Mishnah therefore paskins usher. It's usher because it's an actually enforceable neder, right? Now you might ask an interesting question. Why do you need kinui nidarim if yadas exist, right? If a person says, this, we know, particular according to Reish Lakish, it's a bit of a chiddush because we have no idea what he's talking about when he words konim and Chazal created it. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, you're simply using another language or an expression, right? So if a guy said this is usher like a konim, and konim in some other language means carbon, you know exactly what he means. It should be no worse than a yad, right? This is discussed in many. I mean, the various shortim given to this, but the one that I think that actually the Daf HaShavua materials actually notes is because it's one thing to say there's a standard form and I truncated it, right? And therefore we can imagine you meant the rest of the standard form, okay? But if you actually use a corrupted language or a corrupted expression, it becomes a lot harder to say that that's exactly what I meant, or it's more debatable that's what you meant. You've actually used something that is nonsensical, right? Here you did something that's incomplete, but might be able to fill in the gaps. Here you did something that's internally inconsistent or doesn't make sense at all. Perhaps it's worth nothing, and therefore kinuyim are a chiddush that you might not have known had you merely known yados. Okay.
So is it entirely? Is it entirely situational, meaning that as long as you are absolutely certain of the person's intent, the language doesn't matter?
I wouldn't say that, because we see that in kinuyim. You have that. You know, there is, for instance, let's say you say a shvua b'lashon neder. Okay, you say this chazer is usher and I am not allowed to eat it. You know, something like that, which is like a little bit of both, right? There's a big machlekes rishonim whether that works, right? Now you might say I can divine your intent. The Ramban Paskin is exactly like that. Others say no, you know that's just nonsense. You can never say a shvua b'lashon neder or a neder b'lashon shvua. Neder is an isser gavra if you describe it in a way where it's an isser. I'm sorry, neder is an isser chefza. If you describe it in a way that's an isser gavra, even though we know what your intention is, makes no difference. There's limits to this concept.
Right, but let's say that right now, if we're still in the time when this all works, that let's say that right now I would say I'm invoking my superpower as to those tissues.
Yep.
Right now, everybody here knows exactly what I'm meaning, right? But if that works, then why are we talking about all of this at all? Because then you're talking about an entirely different thing, which is the Gemara should have said, or the Mishnah should have said.
Yeah,
the
so
person's intent.
So
you know what I mean? Like that.
Sure, intent. It is clear. V'nidreit staka, and maybe nidrei b'akabayis. Intent is all that matters. So it could be something becomes a carbon merely you thinking it. By nidarim, you have to verbalize something, and therefore the debate will be is what is the minimum verbalization required, right? So you can't. So it might be that I'm invoking my superpower to ask for this might be enough, but if you said things that don't meet those minimum standards, it's not going to work. It's different. It's not merely intent. That's pretty clear for nidarim at least. Nidrei yisur, I should say. Sukkah, there's also hatzlacha. You see an ani, and you actually think about giving him money. You may have a chiyuv even already. Very different.
I don't know. It just seems like It seems like at the beginning we're talking about a degree of formality around this that is required in order to make it effective. But it seems like the more we talk, we're sort of theory.
Yes. It's not right. It is true. There's standard formulation, which is very formal for sure. And there are other things that work too, but there are limits that there has to be some verbalization. You can't just be purely. It's not the Wild West where you can do whatever you want. And in fact, the last case of the Mishnah would be an example of that. It says "Menuda anilach." Let's say a person says, "I am in nidui from you." Nidui is lashon of excommunication, or a woman becomes a nida. She's asked her to her husband. There's a bit of a they can't be together. Right? He didn't say murchakani, mufreshani. He did not say mudrani. He said menuda anilach. And again, he'll have to continue off. It says shani eichel shani taimlach. Let's say he said that expression. So this evidently is Daf Vav. You'll see this. It's like a big debate. What does exactly menuda mean? Does it mean I don't do business with you? I mean, it might mean that I don't go to your daled amis. You know, how does it make sense to say not going to your daled amis has nothing to do with eating? You know, it's sort of a term of art. So therefore, it's unclear or it's debatable what's intended. So Rabbi Akiva was of two minds on this. He sort of struggled with this a bit, and he came out on the side of saying it's usher. By the way, the Chacham argued on Rabbi Akiva. The Chacham hold it's mutter. So to your point, Howard, this is an expression where you didn't do enough, or you used the wrong kind of things, and therefore your verbalization actually undid what might have been your intent. And by the way, even according to Rabbi Akiva, it's pretty clear you don't get malchus for this if you're Ibrahim. He's answering this lechumra midrabanan, but it's actually not. He wasn't willing to go so far as to say it's a diraisa.
Why isn't she using the lashon of like what I'm going to eat from you? Why not like I can't eat? Meaning like say something that's not like what I'm going to eat from you. That means I have to eat in order for it to be answered. Meaning like I'm talking about something that didn't exist.
It's a strange lashon, but my guess is that.
But it says like from what I'm going to eat from you.
Yes, I'm distanced from you from what I would eat of yours. Yes.
what I would eat.
Yes,
from you,
yes.
or what
Sha'ani, what I would eat from you, yeah.
That sounds like from what I'm gonna eat from you, not from what I would have eaten from you. That's what the lashon sounds like.
Right, but fine, but it's I don't think there's a real.
Which means that technically this whole thing doesn't exist unless I eat from you.
Sure, but I imagine
I
imagine what you're getting into is what was the syntax of people's way they spoke 2,000 years ago, right? And I guess
sounds like that. It sounds like going scratch me and going like
so.
that.
It sounds like people would say that things. People would say, I'm not going to eat from you, and then that's how they'd say it. I'm distant from you from what I would eat from you, from what I would taste from you. It sounds like was the lashon of B'nai Am, is my guess. It is a very in English it doesn't translate quite well, and you get into all these kind of questions. Okay, Victor, Amid Beis. So the Gemara says, Kol kinei nadarim kinadarim, right? So the Gemara observes that by the Masechtas Nazir, the Masechta begins very similar. It says, Kol kinei nazirim, naziris k'naziris. And then it stops, right? Whereas here, we have 4 cases. We have charam k'charam, we have shvuas k'shvuas, naziris k'naziris. So maishna gabe nazir de lekatani l'lakulu, maishna gabe nadarim de katani l'kulu. Why? You have all 4 cases listed here, but we do only have 1 case listed in Nazir, right? So the Gemara answers, Mishum the neder v'shvua ksiva hadadi, because they're written in the same pasuk. Now, by the way, the Gemara doesn't tell us what pasuk they're written in, right? So when things are ambiguous, you wind up typically with a machlekes rishonim. So there are 2 potential candidates for this pasuk. So if you look in Parshas in the first parak of Matos. So it says, Ish ki yidar neder lashem, ay hishava shvua lesar Yisrael nafshe. So there it says, neder and hishava shvua are in the same pasuk. Okay? So neder and shvuas are written together, therefore we're always going to put them together. There's another choice, which is later on, I think it's by pasuk yudal, kol neder v'chol shvuas iser la'aleis nefesh, right? Any neder or shvuas iser. Right, so those are the 2 potential possibilities, and naturally there is a machlekes rishonim as to which pasuk the Gemara is referring to when it says Nedarim and Shvuas are written together. So many say it's the first one, which is actually the more operative. Ishki, the Neder, we learn a lot of halachas about that. Hatfasa the davar another, etc. But others who learn it's the second pasuk. Now, the first pasuk makes more sense. It's the first time it's said, right? Why should you pass over the first pasuk and wait another 10 psukim to find another one, right? You should go to your first available option. But the Mefarish and the Rush actually say it's the latter one, and there are those who say it's because the first pasuk isn't perfect, because it doesn't quite say them together. It says Ish ki yider neder la Hashem, then it says Ayisha v'shvua lesar Yisrael al nafshe. So it's almost there's a separation there in between them, whereas the pasuk in Pasuk Yudala is v'chol neder v'chol shvuas Yisar are much more together. But it's interesting what the power of Oy can do to you to actually cause some Rishonim to not want to go to that pasuk. But anyway, those 2 concepts of neder and shvuos are written together, right? So it's a tani tartan. So therefore, we're going to have 2 of them. We're going to have neder. We're going to have shvua, because if you mention neder, you got to mention shvua. It's a package deal, right? And once we mention 2, well, why don't we do all of them already? We're halfway there, right? The tani tartan, tani lakula. So therefore, we also brought in charamim and naziris. Okay. So the Gemara says, not so fast. If that's the case, the listening kinui shvuos basa nedarim. We should have mentioned kinui shvuos after nedarim. If the whole reason why we have all 4 cases here is because once you mention neder, you mention shvuos, and once you mention shvuos, you're going to get charamim naziris. Well, it seems odd to say neder then charamim. There's no, because at the point in time when you mention charamim, there's no reason to mention charamim. It's like, right? It's only after Shavuos that there's a reason to mention charamim. So shouldn't you have gone, followed that sort of logical progression? So the Gemara says, I did ton nedarim the Mr. Chefzoleh. Once we actually learned nedarim, which is the operation of that, and we'll get to this in a little more detail in a moment, is you aser the chayfetz on you. Okay? This chayfetz, this tissue box becomes aser to me, right? Tani nami charamim. We therefore also learn charamim the Mr. Chefzoleh. Charamim also is an example of where the chayfetz become aser. Whether you hold like the rush, it's going in a case of bedek abayis, where it's going, or it's another expression of nedarim. It's always a chayfetz in those cases, right? Like the Ran. Unlike shvuas, which you asering yourself. If I were to make a shvua, I would be aser to use these tissues, but it wouldn't be the other way around. Okay, so a couple questions worth going through. First, this is actually quite good if you think about it in the Ran's way of thinking. Okay, because the Ran said charamim are simply another type of neder, right? And therefore, it makes quite sense that you'd go neder charamim before you get to Shavuos. Actually, neder charamim are like a package deal. They're just two alternative ways of actually doing the ikr neder, right? However, it's actually not so good if you think about it. Because if that's the case, what was the Gemara even thinking about? Of course, that's why charamim came after neder. Of course, it's like no chiddush now to put it in. So some actually say this is a starker right to the Russia's way of thinking, that charamim are not referring to another case of neder, but they're actually referring to cases of bedek abayis. Because then now you have a good question. You said neder, why are you doing bedek abayis before Shavuos? Shavuos is the whole reason why you're mentioning bedek abayis, right? But interesting point, worth however there. However, this whole concept of whether something's an isser gavra, isser chefta, very brisk here, in Daf Beis and the Darm. So leads to one ask the basic question. Something's chazer. Okay, I can't eat chazer, obviously, Baruch Hashem. Is that an isser chefza or isser gavra? Right? The fact that this piece of pork is usser to me, is it usser to me because it's an isser chefza, the object itself has some sort of isser quality to it? Or it's no, the object itself is neutral, but I have a restriction on it, right? Which one is it? So, again, it's ambiguous, machlekes rishonim, Ritva and Rajba. The Ritva holds it's an isser chefza, and although the Rajba says it's isser gavra, it's sort of a isser chefza-ish kind of isser gavra, which I'm not going to, here's not the place to go through that. Let's just go through with the concept it's an isser gavra, excuse me. Did I say the Ritva said it was an isser chefza? If I did that, I was absolutely wrong. The Ritva says it's an isser gavra, excuse me, and even the Rajba who holds it's an isser chefza, it's like an isser gavra type of chefza, but I want to focus on the Ritva. It's an isser gavra because God told me I'm not allowed to do things. Isurim that Hashem created are generally isurei gavra. You have a requirement to refrain from this. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. It's because we're avadim, Takadish Baruch Hu, and God said, avadim, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. So it's generally an isser gavra, the way the Ritva understands things. Okay? Therefore, pork is also an isser gavra. It's not an isser chefza. It is the exception to that, of course, are nidarim. And karbanis. In a carbon, I have the ability, as I said, I have that superpower to say, boom, this animal is now inherently infused with some sort of holiness, and now it has to be a carbon. And I can draft off that superpower and actually apply it to tissue boxes. So it's nidarim that are the chiddush, where I can actually create isurei chefza. By the way, it's for that reason that the Gemara tells us that if a person were to say, this tissue box is usser like chazer, right? Doesn't work. There's a Mishnah Melech that's has a whole debate about that according to some Rishonim, but let's just go through that. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because it's meaningless. I have to draft off my superpower where I can make something into an isser chefza. Chazer is not an isser chefza. It's an isser gavra. How can I possibly say this tissue box will be usser like something that's an isser gavra? That doesn't even work. Now you could debate whether it should work al siyadis or whatnot, and there's discussions about that, but that is the basic concept.
According to the Ritva, let's say, so why ultimately can't you say anything? Isn't it Hashem in the Torah gave the person the ability to make akdesh? Meaning, still, what is the hezbollah between gavra? Like, what is the nafkamina other than verbally how you formulate?
There are a few nafkaminas. We'll get to that in a second. It's a very good question. There are definitely nafkaminas between whether something is a chefzer or a gavra. Okay, so that's the basic point. Now, in terms of nafkaminas, why don't we just turn to that? There are a few important ones. Okay. Let's say I said, I made a shvua that, on the first day of Yom Tif, I'm not walking into, first day of Yom Tif Sukkos, I'm not walking into any sukkah within the tchum. Okay? And let's take case 2. I said, I'm asering myself, all the sukkahs within the tchum are asr like a carbon. 2 cases. So the first one is a shvua, second one's a neder. Okay? Now, halacha is if a person makes a shvua not to do a mitzvah, it's a shvua shav, it's not chal. For instance, let's say I swear I'm gonna sleep tonight, and then I have a second shvua that I'm not gonna sleep tonight. What's halacha? Well, the first shvua was chal. I swore I'm gonna sleep tonight. What's the second shvua? It's a shvua shav. It can't be chal. I already swore I'm gonna swear. The second shvua is basically a shvua shav. Chas v'shalom, I mentioned God's name, levatala, but it doesn't have any enforceability. You have sworn, by virtue of being a Yid, you are sworn to a God that you're going to go into Sukkot on the first day of Yom Tov. Therefore, you cannot now come along and swear that you're not going to go into a Sukkah. Because, too late. It's like, I already swore I'm going to go into the Sukkah. The second Shvuah is not Chal. It might be a Shvuah Shav. It's a terrible thing, but it's not Chal. It's not enforceable. However, if I say these Sukkahs are are usher to me like a carbon, okay? Well, the fact that they were mutter to you, and now you made them usher, your neder can be chal. It's a terrible thing. You can't be mekayim the mitzvah shua. You could get into a debate if that's a dechalesa say, whether maybe you can or whatever. But the point is that there is an isser here for you to go into that sukkah, because it's an isser chefza. So you can see now a very important difference between, therefore, shvuas and nedarim and how they operate. Okay, another nafkamina that comes out is whether you, if you say a shvua b'lashon neder, right? If I make a shvua but I use sort of a messed up lashon we discussed before and say it in a way that sense that this is usher to me, but not that I'm usher to it. Many Rishonim hold doesn't work because one's an isser gaver, one's an isser chefza. It's a chefza. It's just and although others argue with mitam yonis, and there are other nafkaminas like that. But this I love the one about mitzvahs. It's like really interesting. It's showing you really the difference between the two. Okay. So fine. So we now went through the basics of the Mishnah. We know there are 4 cases. We know why all 4 are mentioned. By the way, since Kinoi Shavuos wasn't mentioned, it's interesting. As I said, Kinoi Shavuos, because Shavuos is only here. It's not actually in Shavuos, but there's Odin of Yadis, as we saw in Taisus. So the Gemara is now going to say but let's actually look at what the Mishnah does. It starts with halachas of Kinuyim, right? Doesn't actually describe Kinuyim. Got to wait to Daf Yud for that, right? And instead starts discussing Yadis, so truncated expressions, right? So the Gemara asks, Pasach b'Kinuyim kol Kinudarim, right? Begins with that. Mufarish Yadis. By the way, it's Madrani. I don't know why it says Maider. Right? So why is it that it starts with Kinuyim? It says kol Kinuyim Kinudarim, and then we bring in 3 other cases for good measure, and then it forgets about Kinuyim and goes to Yadis. Very strange things. Visu Yadis Inchi. Okay, this is the only place I know where the word inchi is used as forget, but evidently that's an Aramaic expression. The Yadis were forgotten about, meaning when the Mishnah was set up, it didn't even mention the concept of Yados. So isn't it odd for say Kol Kinoi Nidarim Kindarim, and it doesn't even mention Yados, and now you're describing Yados. It's worse than actually not describing the thing you just discussed. It's describing something we don't even know about, right? So the Gemara says Ari Baham. Okay, it actually Yadus is in the Mishnah. You just didn't see it because b'chesurei mechsera. There's some surgery is required on the Mishnah. This is the actual text of the Mishnah. What's the actual text? Kol kinedarim kinedarim v'yadus nedarim kinedarim. Right, and I guess would say that also l'chura for. It's a strange thing. You couldn't say Yadus, by the way, for Shavuos because according to what we just said. So I don't know exactly whether you say Kol kinedarim kinedarim then charam kecharamim Shavuos keshavuos. And and the zeros, and then you'd say the Yadis Nidarim Kedarim at the end, because you can't really say that on all of them because there's no such thing as Yad Shavuos, as we said. But anyway, that was there. You just missed it. It was lost. It was lost when Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote it down, or others say actually it's quite often the case that Mishnayos are specifically written with Chesurei Mechsera. It's not a bug; it's a feature. Pachi Yitzchak has a whole shir on this because Torah Shabbat Peh requires amelos and it requires a Mesorah, and Chesurei Mechseras force you to have some amelos and a Mesorah, because without that, you would know what's going on. It's part of the actual system to have Chesurei Mechseras, and Nedarim is starting right with one of those. So the Gemara says, okay, but Lifruashe Kinuyim Beresha, right? Okay, I understand that you're telling me it said Kinuyim, and then it said Yadas, but why are you why are you describing the halachas of Yadas first, right? Why don't you follow the order of the Mishnah, right? FIFO, first in, first out. I'm a tax lawyer, so I have a lot of accountants working for me, so naturally I think of it that way. So the Gemara says, no, we actually like LIFO, is what we like. We like last in, first out. So if it would have said, since it said Kinuyim and then Yados, we're now going to do the second one. We do LIFO. That's the actual typical way, the standard way, if you will, in which we approach describing the various halachas of a set of things. We do the second one first. Okay? And the Gemara is going to bring rayas from this. All interestingly from the Seftas Shabbos. It says, right? For those of you who daven Ashkenaz, you'll say this every Friday night. Right? So we say, what kind of wicks are acceptable to use for Shabbos lighting candles? We want wicks that actually have good light, because if they have poor light, we're worried Shemayata, and you might come to adjust it, which is an Isser Daraisa. So the Mishnah says, what can you light with? What can't you light with? And it first describes what you can't light with. You see, it's LIFO. Right. Next one. But met time ain't time. Ain't time. Then, you're allowed to before Shabbos. You're allowed to insulate something that's hot to keep it to maintain its heat, like a cholent pot, whatever. But you can only use materials that don't add heat. It's an interesting thing, law of entropy and how exactly you add heat, but fine. You can only use materials that don't add heat. It's only materials that maintain heat. So then the Mishnah will describe what materials, you can't use with because they're viewed as adding heat, right? Another case, with what kind of tachshitin can a woman go out on Shabbos? We're worried, she'll say, oh my gosh, look at this ring, take it off, show it to her friend. Oh my God, you're on Shabbos. So there's certain tachshitim which are not easy to remove. She might be able to go out with certain tachshitim which are hard, which are easy to remove. She's not supposed to go out with. And then it says what she can't go out with, right? So therefore, you see, at least in these three examples, it's LIFO. Right? The last in is the first one we actually discuss. Like the Gemara, well, I have a lot of counterexamples to that. The Gemara is going to have 5 counterexamples, although they're not from Shabbos generally. Is it true that it's always LIFO? I'll give you many examples where it's FIFO. The Mishnah in Babasra, Yesh Neichlin Manchilin, Neichlin V'lei Manchilin. There's some people who have a relationship where they can both inherit and bequeath, or some people can only do one. So a father and a son, they both can inherit from each other, and they both can bequeath to each other. A mother and a son, Okay, the son can yarish the mother, but the mother does not generally yarish in the son. And there are also cases where you could do one or the other or none, right? Like for instance, 2 brothers who are maternal brothers, they don't inherit each other. That would be an example of the Einach Le'machlin. So what does it discuss first? It says Yesh Nechel Machilin. It actually discusses the first case. There are 4 cases, and it actually goes with FIFO, right? So that shows you that it's not true that you always go with LIFO. You do last in, first out. Another case. There's some women who when they fall to Yibam, they were mutter to their original husband, and they're also mutter to the Yavam. A regular case. Let's say a Kayin marries a woman, totally mutter to him. A Kayin Hedya marries a woman, he dies, childless. Nevach, his brother, a Kayin also can be Miyabim his wife. What if he was a Kayin Gadol and he married an Almana? Okay, well, it was usher to him, but it's not usher to his brother. What if his brother was the Kayin Hedjit, he married a woman, and then he died, and the Kayin Gadol, his brother, is the Yavam? Well, it's usher to her, because she's an Almana, right? V'cheina, v'cheina. By the way, it's interesting, if you look in the Ran, he says it's a case where the Kayin Gadol was Mekadesh, the woman, and died. He didn't say he married her. L'chura, if he married her, there would have been a bias Isser, right? And they can get a debate whether she's now mutter to a kain. Because a woman who has bia with someone she's not allowed to, even if it's einus, right? A guy is man as a woman, she's also to a kain, right? So therefore, if the kain gadol would have actually married her and been bail her, she'd be usher now to his brother. So therefore, the Ran says l'chura that he was makadosh her, didn't actually marry her, only erison. So anyway, and then what is Anyway, getting back to the case of there's some women who are mutter to one, to both, whatever. What is the first case that's described? It discusses the first case. It's another example of FIFO. Okay, case 3. Yesh tu'unas shemen levana, shemen v'lei levana. There are some carbonates that require oil and levana, frankincense, which are most carbonates. Some that require one, not the other. Like for instance, a carbon site doesn't have levana, right? Levina is a beautiful thing. This woman didn't act like the ways of the Imos. We don't adorn her carbon saita with Levina. But then again, it does the case of FIFO, right? Case number 4. Some carbon minchas require hagasha, bringing it to the southern, southwestern corner of the mizbeach. Some require weighing, some require both. Again, it does FIFO again. One more case, Yesh Bechar L'Nachla, Bein Bechar L'Kayin, Bechar L'Kayin, Bein Bechar L'Nachla, the Ezu Bechar L'Nachla, Bein Bechar L'Kayin, right? Again, there are certain people who are Bechar for Pidyon Aben, right? A woman has her first son, Pidyon Aben. What if she had 2 miscarriages before? Not a Pidyon Aben. But that boy is a Bechar as far as getting a double Yerusha. Okay, if she had 2 miscarriages before. Okay. You can find the reverse as well. What if a person, married wife 1, he had a Bechar, right? Married wife 2, she has a Bechar. Well, that Bechar is not a Bechar Yerusha. He already has a Bechar from wife number 1. That's actually the second section of a Parshas Kiseitze. But she is a Bechar L'Kain, right? She's a Peterecha. So you can find one without the other. And what is, again, the Mishnah explains first? The first case, FIFO. So we have 5 counterexamples of FIFO. right? So how could you say that LIFO is what happens? Our Mishnah is following LIFO, but that's a very debatable thing. So the Gemara answers, Hahu de Pasuk, I'm sorry, I lost place. Hala mishum de avshile mefarshu. Those are different. In the cases we had in Masechta Shabbos, right, which is by Matayim, by Malikim, by Meishin, there were only two cases. There are two categories. You can go out with this, you can't go out with that. You can insulate with this, you can insulate with that. You can light with this, you can't light with it. Only two cases. So there, LIFO is a perfectly reasonable, approach. Because, you sort of just dealt with this, and you'll continue on with this. The 5 counterexamples we had are actually all 4 situations. Because each one, there are 2 elements, and we say sometimes you have both elements, sometimes you have the first and not the second, sometimes you have the second, not the first, sometimes you have neither, right? When you have 4 such categorizations, it'll get quite confusing to jump around between cases, and it was the experience or the understanding of Chazal that if you actually do the last case first, people will just lose cheshbon, and therefore they went strictly in the order in which they were actually appeared in the Mishnah. Okay? The Gemara says, not so fast. I can find you a counterexample of 2, and yet we did FIFO. And what's that? What can a behema go out with? There's certain things it can wear on Shabbos. It's considered for its own bed, but certain things are considered tachshel behema or not required, and therefore, there are different halachas of what they can wear. And what's the first case that's described? Because they're not 4 cases, they're 2. V'katani yaitza gamel. The first thing it's discussed is what a camel can go out with, and therefore what you see is that sometimes even when there's 2 cases, we do FIFO. So why is our Mishnah choosing in a case of 2 cases LIFO? Now, a question that I have, I've seen no one ask this, but it's really annoying me. So I'm just going to use this bully pulpit to express what's annoying me. Where is the 3 cases of LIFO? Okay, where are they? So we have Daf Chaf in Shabbos, which is Banei Madlikin. We have Daf Mem Zayin, which is a case of Banei Taimin. And we have Daf Nun Zayin, which is a case of Banei Isha. So we have the 20th Daf, the 47th Daf, and the 57th Daf. Those are all cases of LIFO. This counterexample is where? It's on Daf Nun Aleph. It's on the 51st blot. So isn't it strikes me as really convenient that the Gemara, when it's trying to bring rayas of LIFO, it goes, there are 4 cases in Shabbos on the 20th, 47th, 51st, and 57th Daf. The 20th, 47th, and 57th are the good rayas, and somehow it forgot about the one on page 51. It's kind of really odd to me that it just sort of missed that. I mean, it knew full well how to go through Masechta Shabbos. But anyway, here is where it pops up as a counterexample.
Does anyone talk about why it's a change of the lashon, like Gamal Yitzis instead of Behema Yitzis?
That's discussed in Masechta Shabbos. I'm pretty sure about that.
Maybe that's why it was left out, because it wasn't like a perfect...
Oh, I see. I hear. Ella lav dafka. The inescapable conclusion. This is all lav dafka. The lashon, the order what you choose is not. There's not one way you do it. Zin the mefarish ahu the pasuk bereisha. Sometimes we do FIFO. You do the one you started with first. Zin ahu the salag mefarish bereisha. Sometimes we actually do the second one first, which is LIFO. Now, just a couple of observations. One is, as a lawyer, and I'm sure, in the back there, you'd say the same, we frown upon contracts that have different expressions in different places. You don't like that, right? Because it almost leads to an inference that something else is going on here. So if you express this, operative term here this way, we don't like it and you express it differently elsewhere. And their corporate associates in a good law firm will make sure it's all the same. So it's interesting that we do it in different ways here. And Rafarshim explained, because this is the point, there is absolutely no big deal which way you go, and we want to show you it's no big deal which way you go by actually doing it differently in different places, even in the same Masechta, even when you're only describing 2. What's important is say it in a way that will help people remember it, and it turns out if one way is better for whatever reason, that's the way we want. Okay. The other observation I'd make is that this idea that, it's lav dafka, that might only be 4 cases of 2. It's not necessarily the case that the Gemara's hanacha, that when you have 4, you many cases, that you might still actually do a case of FIFO. And in fact, the 5, no counterexamples brought to that. Anyway, that's all I have.
Oh, yes, very
Go
nice.
ahead.
Oh.